I want you to think back to that special night and that special meal that you'll never forget. What made it so special? What about the aromas that take you back in time, like Grandma's cookies or Grandpa's garage? These are flavor memories. But what is flavor and where does it come from? I'm Jeremy Storton. I'm an Advanced Cicerone and the host of the Good Beer Matters podcast. I've partnered with the BrewDB to bring you trusted brew knowledge. Trusted Brew Knowledge is a series of videos to help you better understand beer and what to make of it. In this video series, we're going to take a deep dive into the complex world of beer flavor.
My name's Peter Cronin. I'm the quality manager here at AleSmith Brewing Company.
So Peter, we've talked about the flavor of beer coming from different ingredients and how that comes into basically the beer in our glass and how that translates. But what about the aspect of the process of brewing? What about what the brewers are doing and the effect that they have on our final beer? I mean,
Sure.
How's that work?
I think process, generally breweries in the same region tend to get a lot of their ingredients from the same places.
Mm-hmm.
So process is where you're gonna get that house flavor. So just on the brew house behind us, we have all these different ways to change that brew. From 394 to Speedway, one thing that these have different other than just malt is the mash temperature. So Speedway, because it's so alcoholic, it's 12%, it's big, you want that sweetness to balance that alcohol.
Okay.
Also balance the coffee that's in there. So our mash temp is going to be different to create a sweeter beer than 394, which is a little drier.
And so just changing the mash temperature just 2 degrees seems insignificant, but you get a vastly different beer with just a 2-degree difference.
And it's all, that change will also change the balance.
Yeah.
So a dry hoppy beer is probably good with something like a resiny or dank or piney hop, but something tropical, you need that sweetness, or else you're going to get it in aroma, and then it's going to kind of be one-dimensional or flat when there's no sweetness to back up that tropical flavor, or tropical aroma. I love a good tropical beer that also has that sweetness aspect to it.
And I find it interesting that the experience that we consumers are going to have, and whether we enjoy this beer and want to have a second one, or we don't enjoy the beer and we'll never have it again, can all come down to a simple decision on the brewery end of just how much temperature we're going to put in this.
Yeah. From the hot side temperature, and then there's also fermentation temperature. Some of the beers in front of us are fermented with the same yeast, but we just changed the fermentation temperature a little bit to make it a little more estery, a little more fruity, or a little cleaner. But if you go too hot on a fermentation temp, you create all these off flavors.
All these new flavors,
Band-Aidy and medicinal and
fusel alcohols that just burn your face off. And
Speedway at 12% would love to be hot and fusel and alcoholic. You gotta calm it down. You gotta calm that yeast down so it doesn't create those flavors.
Because that drinking experience is not enjoyable.
No.
If there's a bunch of just really hot, spicy, unsavory, pardon the term, unsavory flavors, I'm not gonna have another one.
Right.
But this is a beautiful beer that has to be kind of tamed, so to speak, and so you're gonna tame it through the use of
Tamed
temperature.
is a great word. Speedway definitely needs to be tamed.
Yes, tame the Speedway. What about other things like decoction mashing is another thing that you see a lot, especially in German beers, but in particular beers from the Czech Republic. You see a lot of decoction. What is that, and how do we get flavor out of that?
So just like water back in the day kind of made the profiles of beers that were brewed in those regions, decoction mashing was based off of the malt in those regions. They'd really, from our standpoint today, they had pretty terrible malt in those regions, and it was what's called under-modified. So you needed to extract all the sugar from the malt. You had to do this decoction or double mash.
Yeah, and it's just that's fancy terminology for it's hard to use. It doesn't give up its sugars very easily.
Exactly.
You have to work hard to get these sugars, right?
Right.
And so then the decoction.
And you're doing this double mash. You're not only extracting more sugar by using this process, but you're extracting more malt flavor. So you'll see decoction mashing a lot on box. beers that are still lagers, but just have this depth of malt
Yes.
flavor
Yeah.
that you don't necessarily want with a Pilsner or a Helles.
Yeah. And the term that I think about when it comes to like a decoction mashing and how that translates into flavor, and in particular a component of flavor, the texture, then that's where the term elegant comes out. And I love that term. It's a little esoteric for a beer flavor, but when you taste a good, like a German Bock or Doppelbock that has been decocted, or a Czech Pilsner, and you think about the texture of that, it is just so smooth and so refined and just so incredible when you compare it to a similar version elsewhere.
Right.
And that's where the brewing process can affect that end experience.
Exactly. There's a rest we do in the Mash and Speedway Stout called a beta glucan rest, and it's the only beer we do that to, and it's because in the end, if we didn't do that rest, the body would just be way too heavy for the beer. And you do want a stout to be heavier body,
Yeah.
but just way too much.
Yeah.
So we break down this enzyme a little bit more. We break down this carbohydrate a little more with enzymes, and then it leads to a little more drinkable 12% beer.
Yeah. Because we don't want syrup. We're not
Exactly.
ready for a barley wine yet. We're still
Right.
discussing a stout.
Exactly.
Right? What other processes can really? You mentioned something before about getting more hop aroma. We talked about aroma before and how that's a major part of how we perceive taste and flavor.
Yeah.
But when we talk about a glass, the aromas we're going to get out, hopefully we'll get malt aromas. We should be getting hop aromas. What are some of the things that can suppress these aromas, and some of the procedural things that can express these aromas?
Sure. So something like Speedway isn't dry hopped at all, whereas 394 is dry hopped. And dry hopping is after fermentation, or often now, depending on the beer, sometimes during fermentation, you're adding more hops in. Maybe 20 years ago, people were just adding hops to the boil, to the hot side. With the hops coming out now, with those terpenes that really want to go out of the beer and get up into the air and hopefully into your nose, they don't last during the boil. They don't last, if you're putting it in a 60-minute boil right at the start, by the end of it, you won't have any left.
Yeah, those oils are
So
gone.
they're great dry hopping hops. So during the boil, we're just looking for something to bitter the beer, mostly, or right at the end, what's called a whirlpool addition. When you've turned your boil kettle off and you can throw some hops in there, that aroma will last through. There's actually a beer from a brewery that I had at one of the beer conventions, and it was only whirlpool hops. And it's so cool that even a non-dry hopped beer can have so much aroma, hop aroma and flavor, just from a hot side addition.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me, and I believe that's called hop bursting, but where you get this, I've heard of like hazy IPAs, for example, that have a ton of hop flavor, a ton of hop aroma, but very little bitterness, because they're putting all the hops at the very end, maybe even in the whirlpool itself, so that you can get all these aromas, you can get all these flavors, you can get this experience, but that bitterness is just really, really minimal.
Yeah, and to get nerdy for just a sec, so the bitterness is going to come out of that hop the closer you get to a boil. But basically at 170 degrees, it falls off a cliff. It's very hard to extract the bitterness. So a lot of people will chill during the whirlpool just under 170, then they'll add their hops in. So you're extracting all this, it's still hot, you're extracting all this oil and the terpenes and the mercaptans and all the good stuff from the hops, but you're leaving the bitterness in the hop material.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing of just the procedure itself can change how we consumers experience the beer.
Exactly.
That's fantastic.